Russia is capturing orcas and shipping them here to China. They're getting between $2 and $7 million, we understand, for each animal.
This is a lucrative business. It is wildlife trade, and there's nothing worse but the drug trade when you're talking about scary.
So this is the location that the construction worker told us that the marine mammals are held in before they're displayed. So the orcas are here someplace.
The idea that you're taking naive trainers and dropping in freshly caught killer whales into parks in Russia and China is terrifying.
Seeing orcas in the wild, honestly, it's just indescribable.
It's intimidating and exhilarating at the same time.
That first breath that you hear in person changes your life.
Is just an experience in the wild that is second to none.
Their Latin name, Orcinus orca, roughly translates as demon from hell. They've been the object of fear for most of the time that Western civilization's been aware of them.
The reason they call them killer whales was because they feed on the largest whales in the world, and which are blue whales, which is the largest living animal that's ever lived on the planet. So these guys are so fierce and so intelligent that they can take down animals that are 50 times their size.
Even the U.S. Navy in the 1960s would warn its divers to be especially aware of these animals because they might tear them apart. So then in 1965, somebody got the clever idea to capture one of these gigantic beasts of the sea and put it on public display. His name is Ted Griffin. He was the owner of the old Seattle Aquarium. And two men up in Namu, BC called him, said, "We've got a big old male killer whale in our nets." He flew up there, paid him $8,000 cash on the barrelhead for the killer whale, and put him in a floating cage and towed him all the way back to Seattle with his family following behind. Ted Griffin wasn't a saint. He'd killed a number of killer whales in the process of capturing them. But with Namu, he had a very different and close and intimate relationship.
Griffin was the first man to swim with a killer whale, a daring act that led to total trust and acceptance.
The national and international attraction that this animal brought also changed opinions and attitudes about killer whales. So their fearsome, ferocious reputation changed considerably at that time, and it all started with a young male named Namu.
But Griffin wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. He actually wanted to get a mate for Namu, so he decided to go out and capture a female. But that didn't work out because they didn't get along at all, and she rammed him all the time. So these two guys from San Diego who had a new marine park down there showed up shortly after and asked if they could buy a killer whale from him, and he said, "Well, I have this calf here for you." And they named her Shamu, which was a combination of she and Namu. Thus, the legend was born.
location located inside the park?
They are at Shamu Stadium. We actually have a trainer in the water with one of our whales, the whale that they're not supposed to be in the water with.
On that fateful day in February 2010, Dawn was doing what was called Dine with Shamu. It was a lunchtime performance in a back pool where people sit on tables, and basically Dawn showed the different behaviors and how they make the whale do different things, and everything was going fairly well.
So I believe if you look at the videotape, it was a 12-minute session. She ran out of food. She was probably doing a lot of extra fluffy stuff to impress the VIPs.
But when the show was over and people were leaving, she went around to the back of the pool, and there was a slide-out area, and she got in there with Tilikum, which you couldn't get in the water with Tilikum. You couldn't swim with him. That was forbidden. But apparently it was okay to get into like 2 feet of water.
This is the third time this killer whale has been involved in the death of a person over the past 20 years. In this case, it was a seasoned trainer who had worked at this park for 16 years and knew the animal well.
And I remember getting a text about it, and I was very concerned about what had happened and who it might be, regardless if it's somebody I knew or not. It's just one of those, you can't help but, oh my goodness, what's going on?
All of the trainers know that at any given moment, something can go horribly wrong. SeaWorld claimed that Tilikum wasn't aggressive, showed no aggression towards Dawn during that session, and that was the company line. It was just shocking and unbelievable that they would even attempt to do that. We knew, pardon my French, that it was BS, it was bullshit.
Did he mean to kill her? Probably not, because he had a relationship with her. She was one of his social partners. He knew her for many years. I don't think he meant to kill her, but we are very, very fragile compared to an orca. So I think afterwards, while she's under an awning that they put there until the coroner came, and Tilikum is in the medical pool, and he's completely inert. He's just floating there like a log. He's logging. The energy's gone. The frustration is gone. And I imagine his brain was ticking over at that point with, what just happened? And I've always felt, every time I see that footage, very sorry for everybody involved, including Tilikum.
And that's when I said to myself, wow, this is a really, really interesting story. And then I started learning about killer whales in the wild. So the focus, it didn't change, but it expanded from just this incident and the corporate response and the government intervention to the whole question of captivity. I went to see the Believe show in Orlando 2 or 3 times doing my research, and I didn't see any education. I didn't see any science. What I saw was a circus, a show with blaring music. I saw them kissing, I saw them doing backflips, I saw them splashing the audience at the end of the show, and I saw trainers who were basically just dancing on the side of the pool. It was stupid. I just didn't understand it at all.
As long as we call it entertainment, education, research, or conservation, you can do whatever you want to do. And so the children walk out of this park miseducated, confused, and it's teaching them that abusing nature is okay.
Four years before Don Rancho was killed, a trainer named Ken Peters was attacked by one of their whales in the San Diego park, Casadca. So at the hearing for Don Rancho, for the very first time, the public saw the video, the full video, and it was way more dramatic than I had been led to believe. It was terrifying. He looked terrified. And I don't remember how many people were in the courtroom, but everybody was holding their breath. And they knew how it ended, and they were still holding their breath.
That video I later leaked to the media because it's chilling, and that also got a lot of attention.
I do think one of the reasons why this changed everything was because people do have a history with SeaWorld that is nothing but positive. SeaWorld was right up there with Mom and Apple Pie. And everything they said about how happy their animals were and how coming to SeaWorld was just a great day. And then suddenly something happens that is so not consistent with the narrative.
I honestly thought it was going to be one of those little indie documentaries that 7 people on a Saturday night go see at the Angelica Theater. It did not turn out that way. It had record crowds starting at Sundance on, and Magnolia Pictures did a really, really smart thing at Sundance. They sold it to CNN. And when CNN aired it, that was it.
So in the wake of all this, SeaWorld pushed back very hard with a PR campaign. They set up a website called The Truth About Blackfish that had 69 points in it, and did this massive advertising campaign that was designed basically to castigate the cast and crew of the film.
69, I was very intrigued with this number. Kind of says it all, really, doesn't it? Couldn't find 68 or 70. And some of them were really, really funny. I mean, they were hilarious. They took one of my scientific papers and distorted the heck out of it. And it was so distorted that it was really, really funny. So they started their Ask SeaWorld campaign. How many of you guys saw this?
Hi, my name is Allison, and I'm a killer whale trainer here at SeaWorld Orlando. We received a question from Annalise asking if killer whales could hear their trainers talking. Well, the answer is yes, they can hear us talking, but the more effective way to communicate with them is through hand signals, which asks them for behaviors, and our whistle, which lets them know that's what we were looking for, and that some type of reinforcement is on the way. Thanks for your question, Annalise. For more information, visit AskSeaWorld.com.
They lie to people about these animals and their life history and their behavior. They tell people dorsal fins collapse naturally. They tell people that it's perfectly normal for killer whales to live about 25 to 35 years. It is not perfectly normal. Their lifespan in nature is a lot longer than that. It varies depending on the ecotype, but we know that orcas in the Pacific Northwest, for example, can live into their 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe even their 90s. So for SeaWorld to tell people that, that's just offensive to me.
Blackfish exceeded expectation, and there's a phrase called the Blackfish effect that I helped coin. It blew everyone away. The trainers just wanted to get the story out. This had been a story that needed to be told for a long time, and we never could have predicted the influence and the depth with which it's penetrated the culture.
I would say the Blackfish effect, it had a horrible impact on SeaWorld. On attendance, on stock prices, on reputation, on corporate partners, on entertainers coming. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. So Blackfish shot an arrow into the heart of that business, and it's still struggling. They didn't kill it, but they wounded it. On the flip side, it changed attitudes, kind of like what happened with Namu back in 1965.
The animal activist movement has been around a long time. The Blackfish effect is like a jumbo booster shot that has kind of sent it, at least temporarily, into the stratosphere.
I mean, I can say it. I just don't think, after my 2 years of making this film, going from taking my kids to SeaWorld to where I am now, I don't think it's a wise place to spend your money. I hope people don't go.
Blackfish was an inspiration for Empty the Tanks. The first annual Empty the Tanks event actually happened on the Saturday after the premiere of Blackfish. Today is the 6th annual Empty the Tanks worldwide event, and there is an event happening in downtown Seattle at Pier 56, which is the site of the original Seattle Marine Aquarium, which is where Namu came from. We have over 70 locations taking place in 21 countries, pretty global everywhere.
The world's 3 loneliest orcas would be Shemank in Argentina, Lolita at Miami SeaWorld in Miami, and Kiska at Marineland in Niagara Falls, Ontario. Kiska has remained at Marineland Canada ever since, and she's roughly 42 years old now. Over the years, she's had 5 calves, and all 5 of them are now dead. And now she's left in entire social isolation, not even with a dolphin. Kiska has been alone for just over 6 years now, entirely alone. And I can't imagine what goes through her head being so alone and in such a barren tank with not even weeds in it.
Part of the problem with the USDA is that it serves a dual mission. So we have had to challenge the USDA in numerous cases where they clearly are failing absolutely to do their job, which is to protect animals kept in captivity, and instead treat themselves like a rubber stamping permitting agency.
Breaks my heart to have to talk about Hugo or even think about Hugo. He died of brain aneurysm from ramming his head into the concrete walls. Suicide. He died of suicide. The Seaquarium put him in a dump truck and took him to the city dump, and just dumped him like that.
What the Miami SeaWorld did was dodge a big bullet. You had a Cat 5 storm coming right at Lolita in an aged stadium that would have surely ripped the roof off that stadium, but at the last second, Irma jogged left and ended up heading to Tampa. If that little jog in direction hadn't have occurred, I don't think Lolita would be alive right now. The idea that they did not move her out of the way of that storm is unfathomable.
Trade in wildlife in general is a corrupt industry, but the trade in whales and dolphins for live display is very corrupt. When Russia started capturing orcas, in addition to the beluga capture operation, that was pretty mind-blowing. That had not happened globally in decades, and so it was very regressive when they started doing that.
These waters, the Sea of Okhotsk, are very remote, and so it's very hard for us to get any sense for how many killer whales have died in these Russian captures. But the estimates are around 30. And from what we've seen of the orcas that have shown up in the parks, that's probably an accurate number. What we do know is that they captured an 8-year-old female named Narnia and a 6-year-old male named Nord. And those two captures did not eat for the longest time. They later added a young female named Juliet to the mix.
We absolutely felt that we needed to protect the trainers. There had been a record over a period of 20 years of dangerous interactions. 2 people were killed, others were injured. Dawn Branshaw's death was what brought the case forward, but it was only 2 months before that, on Christmas Eve, 2009, when a trainer was killed in the Canary Islands. Again, unanticipated. Just happened.
SeaWorld fought very hard to keep trainers in the water. Their argument was that they could predict behavior 98 to 99% of the time, and they did some simple math based on all of the interactions that they added up over the years and said, well, we can predict behavior this accurately. And the counter argument, of course, is that what about that 1%?
One of the judges of the panel was eventually nominated to the Supreme Court, but never got there, and never even got to a Senate hearing. And then SeaWorld changed its attorneys at that stage, and they actually got Antonin Scalia's son to represent them, which added some political flavor to the proceedings.
It's as if the federal government came in and told the NFL that close contact on the football field would have to end because, after all, more people are injured in the NFL on any given Sunday than were injured in the 22-year period that OSHA looked at in this case.
Now, we only responded to that in a sentence or two in our brief, but at the oral argument, this was the main argument that the lawyer for SeaWorld made. So it did seem to be attractive to one of the judges, and it turned out that later, that when the decision came down, that one of the judges accepted that argument and thought that OSHA can't ban football, therefore it can't regulate SeaWorld.
A fundamental flaw in Eugene Scalia's argument comparing playing in the NFL to training orcas is simply that when you're in the NFL, you're playing against other people. Dawn Brancheau was taking a risk, and with an animal who's 25 to 50 times the size of a person and has such incredible power, the risk can't even be estimated.
We were jubilant. We had put a lot of hours and hours into it, both at the trial level and then at the appeal level, and we were thrilled that we won.
So the product, which was the bond between the trainer and the whale that SeaWorld was selling, went away. No more getting in the water. It's all going to be from the deck.
The singular thing that focused me on this issue was the film Blackfish. So we sat down with my staff, we devised a plan for legislation, and out of that was born AB 2140. The next step for us was to draft legislation, which we did, and then to announce it to the world, which we did at a press conference in Santa Monica on the Santa Monica Pier.
AB 2140 will end performance-based entertainment for all orcas in the state of California. It will end captive orca breeding, and it will end the import and export of orcas into and out of the state. And lastly, it will limit the type of human interaction for trainer safety.
SeaWorld immediately went into crisis mode. They reacted very strongly to the bill, as we knew they would. But this is also a very political place. SeaWorld has had a presence in the Capitol for many, many years. And so we were up against a very strong, well-funded operation. And the bill didn't make it out of its first committee.
So the individual orca, Narnia, Nord, and Juliet, they were captured at different times, and then they were brought in there, and the behaviours that I've seen in there, it's really sad to watch. And I liken it to a gulag for orca. These poor animals are kept inside all the time. They never see the daylight. Tiny, tiny tanks. It's just tragic to see.
Orcas are a lot like people, that they have culture. They have different languages. They behave differently, they even eat differently. So we have mammal eaters and fish eaters, and they have different hunting techniques depending on what it is they're trying to kill. So that was the one problem. I mean, do these trainers even know how to deal with belugas and bottlenose dolphins, let alone orcas? But the second problem was that these orcas were coming from a population that were mammal eaters. And this is one of the reasons for this is Russia does not recognize that there are different ecotypes. And then you traumatize them, and then you transport them, and then you dump them in a tank. It's just a bad recipe.
The Chinese society is experiencing a tremendous change from virtually no middle class at the turn of the century to one that would reach 800 million by 2025. The consumption that is pursued by the Chinese middle class has gone even more rampant.
China is the sleeping dragon on all sorts of things, including what they call the ocean theme park industry. If you look at the industry globally, that's the expansion market. That's where they're putting them up every other day.
There's a big demand for killer whales in China. Russia is supplying them. A few years ago, before the Russians developed the techniques to capture those animals, they approached me to teach them how to catch them. They offered me $7 million for 8 animals over 2 years. And I thought serious about it. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money to anybody. That's more money than I'll ever see in my life. But I could not do it. I just could not do it.
In July 2014, off Russia's east coast in the Sea of Okhotsk, they captured 2 killer whales under a permit for ostensibly educational and cultural purposes. They were both sent to China.
It's usually difficult to try to get at the market value of a whale or a dolphin. It's whatever the market will bear, really. My understanding is that some of these orcas are going for millions of dollars, whether it's 1 million or 10 million, it's somewhere in there.
With that kind of money, there's potential, inevitability, I should say, for corruption in 2 places that are notoriously corrupt, Russia and China.
This is a lucrative business. It is wildlife trade, and there's nothing worse but the drug trade when you're talking about scary. People have to understand that China is about 40 or 50 years behind us in terms of their sophistication toward this industry. They are building brand new facilities that look like they're from the 1960s. They're putting species together like belugas, which are Arctic animals, with bottlenose dolphins, which are temperate water animals, which is something that the West used to do back in the 1960s. There can be animals performing with clear injuries or illnesses obvious to the layperson, and nobody says anything. I mean, I look at this animal and I see its skin condition and I'm like, that animal should be in a veterinary hospital, and yet it's performing, and nobody's saying anything. And so one of the things I observed, for example, was some beluga whales screaming. It was a bizarre vocalization. It wasn't natural at all. It was in air. It was completely bizarre. And if I had to take a guess why they were doing it, it was to get the attention of their trainers who were wandering around and not paying the slightest bit of attention to them. Again, not appropriate. From a safety perspective, I'm very concerned about some of the things I saw in China. For example, and again, I've never seen this before in the West, the dolphins were actually going over a low wall that separated two enclosures. And the reason that's a problem is, one, that's not what you want them to do. You don't want them to be in that enclosure. You want them to be in this enclosure for husbandry reasons. So they're just doing what they want, which is never a good thing. Historically, in the West, you would see all sorts of silly pet tricks and circus-type things that are gone now. But I saw a lot of that still. One of those things is putting a young child, who apparently has to be at least 4 or 5 years of age, into a little dinghy, giving the line to a dolphin, then they put the ring on their snout, and then they start towing the little dinghy around. This is a 5-year-old with a life jacket on, being towed out into an enclosure with a bunch of dolphins in it, who are being distracted by their trainers. What if that kid just decided, I'm gonna stand up, panic, and go over the side? It was mind-numbing to see that happen. It's so dangerous because you can't trust a 5-year-old to do what he or she's told. So the idea, for example, of somebody seeing something like a member of the public seeing something like and going, oh my gosh, what's wrong with these people, and filing a complaint, that doesn't happen in China. They just smile and clap and think it's great. And in the midst of all of this, there apparently had been some sort of dialogue started between SeaWorld's Joel Manby and the Humane Society of the United States' Wayne Pacelli, who was their CEO. And that dialogue had been started by a mutual acquaintance who was a former congressman. So suddenly, in March of 2016, very much out of the blue, for me and for everybody else who knew nothing about this dialogue between the Humane Society of the US and SeaWorld, we hear this announcement that SeaWorld is going to end its orca program through attrition.
Today, people are concerned about the world's largest animals like never before. So, we too must change. That's why the orcas in our care will be the last generation at SeaWorld. There will be no more breeding. We're also phasing out orca theatrical shows. They'll continue to receive the highest standard of care available anywhere. And guests can come to see them simply being their majestic selves, inspiring the next generation of people to love them as you do.
So they realized they were going to have to shift their business model and not be based on forcing orcas to perform silly tricks for people for profit.
I want a state law that says that for California, there will never again be breeding in captivity, and there will never be a place where orcas can be taken and kept in captivity.
Tilikum was 2 years old when he was captured off the waters of Iceland. So that meant that he spent 33 years in captivity and sired 21 calves. Sadly, 11 of them died before he did. And when he did die, he was estimated to be worth several $1 million.
I worked with Tilikum for about 2 years. I was a senior trainer at Shamu Stadium, and which meant that I did get to work with him. I mean, he was a good boy. He was responsive. He was often isolated, and so I think he enjoyed the interaction that he got. He worked well with most of the trainers that were working with him, and I miss him. was taking SeaWorld's pledge and putting it into law because for two reasons. One, it made sense to start there. They had already done the work, but the second reason to take their language was to test the truthfulness, to test the honesty, to test their real intent here, which was, listen, I've taken your exact pledge. Word for word, I've changed nothing. And I'm just gonna put it into law. That's all I'm gonna do. Because SeaWorld, I don't want another company to come in and do what you're pledging not to do. That's unfair to you. I'm gonna prevent that competition. You would have thought they would have jumped all over that, but no, they did the exact opposite. They made sure it didn't happen. They viewed actually media on this issue as a bigger threat than the bill. SeaWorld's business model is to display captive animals, and I think that is one reason why SeaWorld fought voraciously not to get the bill passed in Florida, because I would not be surprised to see orcas in Texas and Florida being shipped to China. Let me be clear to SeaWorld right now, whatever they think they can get away with, they're not gonna get away with it. They start playing around with this, they start tinkering, finding little holes in the law, they start getting cute, the public is gonna react, and the reaction is gonna be swift. And people are not gonna go to the parks that bear the SeaWorld name if they're engaging in this behavior. I mean, corporate boycotts matter, and you wanna change corporate behavior, don't give them your money.
In an attempt to turn things around, SeaWorld introduced this new show called Orca Encounter. And it was, more educational than most of its previous shows had ever been. But a lot of the footage featured orcas from the wild. How ironic is that?
Welcome to SeaWorld's Orca Encounter. We're so honored to introduce you to this intriguing and majestic animal.
When SeaWorld says it's providing enrichment to its animals and exercise programs, it's nothing new. The animals have a regimen of sessions that are conducted with them all week long. Some of those sessions are called enrichment, some of them are called exercise. These are just PR terms. They have very little real meaning, in my opinion.
Corky, ladies and gentlemen, is the oldest whale here at SeaWorld. She is 53 years old. And every day she impresses me with her docile nature and her sweet personality.
Operant conditioning is certainly an issue, and trainers of animals use operant conditioning. The problem is, what are we conditioning the animal to become? And basically, we are taking them out of their natural way of being and turning them into robots who do tricks. And operant conditioning is very effective for doing that.
They're doing the show for their food. It's the only animal in the zoo that has to do a show in order to be fed.
We had the Jumbotron back when I worked there, and we also showed pictures and video on that big screen of orcas in the wild. And I can remember the orcas in the front pools while that video was playing, just spy hopping and looking at those videos of wild orcas. And I thought, what must be going through their minds to see that? Because they're clearly interested in it.
The tricks really aren't any different. The trainer is telling generally the animals to do it behind the scenes. They come out, they do their trick, and then they go back behind the scenes to get their fish. But what has changed is the facade for the humans, what we see sitting in the stadium. We see trees and running water and fancy rocks and all of this sort of thing.
I don't even get how somebody can watch that and not see the irony.
Thousands of dollars spent on setting this all up for us, but nothing has changed for the whales.
сколько погибло животных во время отлова. То есть это просто здесь система построена так, что как бы они очень мобильные.
А со стороны отловщиков на ваш адрес уже поступала была открытая угроза и что, стрельба?
Да, то есть мы когда подходили к кораблю, где были животные привозили, сказали, вообще снимать здесь нельзя, как достаточно агрессивно. Вот мы понимаем, что те 7 человек, которые у нас есть, мы не можем уходить.
Over the years, people have asked me, what is the worst thing that happens to these animals in captivity? And I very often have responded by saying they're bored. And people go, well, that's not so bad. It's terrible. If you're bored all the time, it can cause depression. It can affect your health. And eventually, it can cause health problems that might even kill you. Depression kills.
Dolphins and whales and porpoises are echolocators. They have a very sophisticated hearing or auditory system, and that's the system they depend upon the most.
So if we compare it to our experience, we're visual animals. So living in a concrete tank for an orca may be very much like me living in a 10-foot by 10-foot room with 10-foot high ceilings.
Echolocation has two purposes. They explore their environment with it and they communicate with each other. At first they're going to get back a lot of echoes, and eventually they're going to realize that there's no information coming in at all. There's nothing to echolocate on. And at that point, they simply shut down.
And when we say it's typical for an orca to travel 100 or more miles a day, we mean a straight line. So basically, they have to circle over and over and over their tank before they can get just the exercise they need to be healthy. It's not healthy because they're not swimming in a straight line. They're not going at speed. These are very dynamic animals. Dynamism isn't really accommodated in a tank.
Orcas and other cetaceans in concrete tanks are being imprisoned. And even though solitary confinement is just traumatizing for humans, it's at least as traumatizing for dolphins and whales because they're so social.
There are definitely parallels between the solitary confinement of human beings and the captivity of wild animals. Depending on how social the animal is naturally, the caging of the animal destroys their entire way of life. And that's very true of the prisoner in solitary confinement.
If you could put every emotion of the human spirit of hopelessness, pain, agony, hatred, frustration, a sense of continuous silently screaming, all these emotions while you're locked in this cage treated like some animal.
Prisoners very frequently report to me that they are becoming something other than themselves. So people who were previously gregarious find themselves uninterested in relating to other people. People who were peaceful and empathic find themselves being bitter and angry and wanting to hurt somebody. With the orca, what we're doing is removing them from their natural habitat, their family, their community, their complex communication system, and we're putting them in a cage where there's nothing for them to communicate or no meaningful activity for them to do.
You know, it's once you see them in the wilds, you see that's what a whale is, as opposed to seeing them in a concrete tank, doing tricks. That's not a whale. That's not a whale.
So the idea that they spend all this time doing nothing, floating like a log, we call it logging. It's very unusual in the wild to see them do that for more than 2 or 3 minutes at a time. They do it for hours at a time in captivity.
Killer whales in captivity swim circular patterns, they grind their teeth. They also do jaw-popping activities where they'll bite down on the horizontal steel bars that separate animals between pools. They have deformities that come directly from captivity, including collapsed fins and broken teeth. And they're kept kind of on the verge of hunger in captivity because that's a control mechanism, and it's one of the only control mechanisms we have over them as trainers. So they're always on the cusp of being hungry.
We've been telling the same lie over and over again, and if you keep repeating the same thing over and over again, somehow it becomes the truth. And so I see all of these people at the park applauding something they should be rebelling against.
We hope you've gained a greater appreciation for these incredible animals. Have a great rest of your day here at SeaWorld.
Captive killer whales live in a shallow water column with minimal to no shade, with a black surface. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out the damage that is done to their skin. We used to apply black zinc oxide as a protectant to not only paint the animals black to cover up their sunburn, but also to block the sun. It's incredibly pathological to have, you know, bubbled skin, and yet we would see it on killer whales at SeaWorld.
The social structure of the orcas in the wild is completely different than the social structure that is manipulated and set up in the captive environment. So removing animals from their mother, removing them from their siblings or half-siblings, entirely different than what would happen and what does happen out in the wild.
Separations are gut-wrenching. It involves separating a mother and a baby and using gates and a crane. These animals are smart, and they know when a crane rolls up, either it's one of two things: someone's leaving, someone's sick, and in other cases, someone's dead.
Kalina was the original baby Shamu, so lots of fanfare surrounding her birth. I had the opportunity to work closely with her when she was young. I was honestly shocked when I learned that we would be moving her from the park in Orlando and that she would be removed from her half-sister, from her mother, and be sent to a park where she would not know anybody. It was heartbreaking for me. When I spoke out about it, I was mocked, I was ridiculed, and I couldn't get over that. I was ridiculed, and there was nobody else that seemed to feel the same way. So the night that they removed Kalina, I observed Katina, her mother. I have never seen Katina act anywhere near the way she acted that night. And it was clear to me that what I was seeing was grief. I mean, there was no other word for it. In the corner of a tank, vocalizing, there's nothing else to call it but screaming, screeching, crying. And it was so powerful. You know, I did my job that night, and I stayed and I watched it, and I documented what I saw. And it wasn't until I got in my car, to go home that it really hit me, like what I had just been involved in. And this is what I ended up doing, is I started crying on my way home. And that's not the only time that Katina has had to go through this in her life. She's had 5 out of her 7 calves removed from her in the time that she has been in captivity.
If someone were to take away my son when he was younger, say 4 years old, 5 years old, I would be entirely lost. I would have no will to live anymore. It's something I really can't imagine. And I don't think most parents would ever even want to think about it, let alone experience something like that. It would just be unfathomable to me.
I've said that orcas are the brainiacs of the planet way before humans were, and that's absolutely true. That's a fact. Orcas and other cetaceans have had their big brains for a lot longer than our ancestors have.
The parallels between orca and humans is almost uncanny, constantly reaching out and touching each other and reassuring each other. And this tactile behavior, it doesn't matter whether they're even in captivity, you still see that.
The kind of a mind that an orca brain produces is a mind that is sophisticated, complex beyond our comprehension, a mind that integrates feelings and emotions with thought, a mind that integrates vision and hearing in ways that we don't understand.
When I looked into the eyes of the whales that I was working with, especially the ones that I was working with the most and I was most connected to, I saw friendship. I saw, hey, cool, something to do, somebody to interact with. I saw intelligence. I saw, what do you want me to do next? I saw, how can I make you happy? I saw all those things.
I mean, they're looking back, they're tracking you, they're watching everything that you do, and you definitely know somebody's home.
So Shamu, if you're ready, let's go for it.
And they're communicating with you using nonverbal communication, just like 2 humans. And they each have their likes and their dislikes. And one of the coolest things about working there is developing your own personal relationship with your particular whale.
When you look at the orca brain through an MRI image, what you see are many features that actually exceed the human brain in terms of elaboration. So if you look at a part of any brain and you see a lot of tissue packed into an area, you know that is important for that species, that they're doing something really exceptional or really sophisticated or complex. So when we talk about the human brain having gray matter and wrinkles, they have more.
Killer whales are such an intelligent animal. When we're working with them, whether it's in captivity or in the wild, it's like playing 3-dimensional chess. You just don't know what they're going to do next.
Well, intelligence, I wrestled with that word for many years during the Flipper TV series. I lived with those dolphins for 5 years. And I've come to believe that dolphins are not more intelligent or less intelligent. They're simply different than we are.
What's really clear is that feelings and emotions come into play in orca and cetacean psychology in a very, very intense and very, very fundamental way.
Researchers spotted the orca known as J35 yesterday. She was still holding on to her calf in what is being called a tour of grief. And for the first time, we are hearing what's believed to be calls from the mother to her dead calf. And experts say this is a sound of mourning. It was recorded by one of the Whale Museum's underwater microphones.
I don't know if we can say one species is smarter than the other. What I can say is that orcas are comparably complex and intelligent, on a par with humans. It is a mind that is so complex that it cannot survive in a concrete tank. It doesn't fit. It's like putting a square peg in a round hole. It doesn't go.
I had the privilege of managing the Keiko project in Iceland and got to experience firsthand how whales communicate and socialize together. One day when I was in a helicopter, and Keiko was about 10 miles offshore adjacent to our boat. And I noticed that there were some whales about 2 miles from Keiko. It was a group of 15 and they were swimming toward him. And this is always what we wanted, because we wanted to see if Keiko would approach the whales and stay with them in some way, and if they would accept him as he did so. So this was a beautiful experience for us. And as I watched, they divided into 3 groups, with 5 continuing directly toward Keiko, 5 going wide to the east, and 5 going wide to the west. And as the 5 got close to Keiko, they all thrashed around for a few minutes. They weren't terribly interested. He wasn't. He came back to the boat. They swam on, and as they got further away, the 5 from the east, 5 from the west, rejoined, and they all swam off. Well, what had we witnessed? We'd witnessed a plan to deal with something or someone unknown to the group. Communication of the plan and execution of the plan without putting the whole group at risk. Kind of a classic military pincher movement. Now, we had hydrophones in the water the whole time, and we didn't hear a single sound from Keiko or the wild whales in advance of the interaction at the boat, near the boat. Yet they knew he was there, and they dealt with it as a group. Pretty remarkable.
I think what the National Aquarium in Baltimore is doing is incredible. I think they are showing the leadership that needs to happen within the captivity industry. They recognize the fact that this is a dying industry. This isn't something people want to be a part of. People don't want to see dolphins in concrete tanks. They don't want to see orcas jumping around, doing circus tricks. And they're taking that initiative and they're creating a sanctuary for their dolphins.
We need to get out of that awful era that we've been through for the last 100 years of caging animals.
It's an exciting experiment because everything we're doing is groundbreaking. And there's something about that that's, very satisfying to give these dolphins the opportunity to truly thrive.
The Animal Legal Defense Fund devotes a part of its work to addressing the fundamental problem for animals under the law, which is that the law still considers them property, essentially things. The Non-Human Rights Project, who we work closely with, Steve Wise has a vision that he can end that with one big case where that would recognize personhood specifically.
Mr. Weiss, I believe your arguments.
Thank you, Your Honor. Every time I walk into a courtroom, we are concerned that we're going to be encountering a judge who believes that the term person is synonymous with the word human. Person means that an entity has the capacity for legal rights.
A landmark lawsuit was brought on behalf of Tommy, who lives caged on his owner's property in Gloversville.
The first client that the Non-Human Rights Project had was a chimpanzee named Tommy. In fact, Tommy still is our client, and the latest decision that came down in one of his cases was just 2 weeks ago.
It's, are you a human? You have rights. You're not a human, you don't.
Now, the High Court of New York rejects 96% or so of all the cases brought before them, not on their merits. They just decide that they aren't going to accept it. That was on May 8th of 2018. However, along with that came an extraordinary concurring opinion by Judge Eugene Fahey. Judge Fahey called the situation in which a chimpanzee can essentially be, confined to a cage and for life, a, quote, manifest injustice, unquote, and said that the courts of New York needed to hear the case, and he chastised the courts who had not heard the case. Judge Fahey's decision, we think, will have influence beyond the state of New York. We've been litigating rights cases now for 3.5 years, so far on behalf of chimpanzees and elephants. We have not litigated a case so far on behalf of orcas. One reason being is that there's no place to put them. The Whale Sanctuary Project, we're hoping, is going to be highly successful, and so once it's up and running, at that point, that major obstacle to us being able to file a lawsuit against SeaWorld will have been removed. The fact that killer whales are still being used, in shows like in SeaWorld is a disgrace. It ought to be illegal. By the time the Non-Human Rights Project is finished, it will be illegal.
Many of us in the marine mammal scientific community realized for a long time that orcas and other cetaceans can't thrive in concrete tanks. They get stressed, they get sick, they die. But there's no alternative for them, because if they're born in concrete tanks, they can't just be dumped back in the ocean. And we realized from looking at what exists for other animals that the step that needs to be taken is sanctuary.
50, 60, 100 acres of water space that you can net off, where a whale can be provided lifetime care, 24/7 veterinarian on call if needed, but no requirement to perform. Do what you want while we provide enrichment, a sanctuary that would be at minimum 300 times as large as the largest tank that Orca are performing in.
And so in 2016, I amassed a group of people together, experts, and said, okay, how do we do this? How do we create something that doesn't exist now, that's a permanent sanctuary? I can tell you unequivocally that we have a dream team on the Whale Sanctuary Project. If we can't do it, nobody can do it. And we'll do it.
We have sanctuaries for tigers and elephants and all of the other animals that maybe get retired out of a circus or some sort of wildlife park.
But there are no sanctuaries for whales, dolphins, and porpoises that have come from captivity, cannot be released back into the wild because they're not competent, they don't know how to hunt, they don't know how to kill. We want to have an alternative.
But how do you find it? And so we started out looking in Google Earth and looking at nautical charts on the Pacific Northwest and on the Atlantic coast, British Columbia and Washington, Maine and Nova Scotia. We had 15, 16 physical criteria for the space in terms of size, salinity, likeliness of ice flow, flushing, all of those elements that we knew ought to be minimum requirements.
And if we can give these animals a chance to be linked to their natural environment so they can hear the sounds and deal with the weather conditions and see fish in their pen and kelp and other things that we just take for granted in the wild, but in captivity they don't have. It's a much, much more stimulating environment.
We see opportunities for research, non-invasive research that you would do with whales. See how they acclimate to this new environment. Observationally, scientists can learn about that and join us, help us learn. And in addition, we see the opportunity for rescue and rehab.
So we could design our sanctuary in a way that partitions off areas that could be specifically used to rehab stranded or injured animals and offer any kind of necessary medical intervention.
So every decision that is made about a sanctuary takes the welfare and the well-being of the animals into account first and foremost. And we want the community to be part and parcel of it every way. So we look for sites where that can happen.
This site here is almost 2/3 of a mile long. It's probably about 100 to 150 meters across, and it has an average depth of about 50 to 60 feet. The deepest point is out at the mouth. It's about 120 feet at the mouth, and varies between 40 to 90 feet all the way through.
And many people say, well, what kind of a wall do you have? How do you keep them in? Well, it's interesting to note that if you just have a buoy line with a net down to the bottom of the water, to the subsurface, the whales never jump over the buoys. Could they? They have the capacity, but they never have. People often ask me, what's the likely cost of a whale sanctuary? It's probably a $15 to $20 million capital cost to create a sanctuary, and the operating costs would run maybe $2 million a year, give or take, depending on the number of animals that are in a sanctuary.
And that means actually building the permanent facility, having staff, having veterinary facilities, and transporting the first residents.
For orca, that's probably 5 to 8 orca at most.
I think the whales that would end up at a sanctuary like the ones proposed for the Whale Sanctuary Project would adjust to their new environment just fine. And I think they'd actually just thrive in that environment.
We have sanctuaries for all sorts of different species. So why not for whales and dolphins? And it's time. We're on the right side of history. It's never going to be perfect, but it's going to be a hell of a lot better than a concrete tank.
At some point, we need to be doing this hand in hand with people in marine parks who want to join and move their animals to sanctuaries. Critter cams are not uncommon today. We can have a critter cam experiences part of this environment, not only underwater, but above water, and it's a natural experience, and it's teaching children and adults about nature from nature.
They would still need to be trained for husbandry behaviors and veterinary behaviors. There would still be jobs for trainers, and there would be footage to show people, and it would all be in this natural habitat, and the whales would be better off in terms of their welfare. How can that not be a win-win solution for them?
Some say, free the whales. For them, nothing else is acceptable. But nothing could be worse for the whales. Most of the orcas at SeaWorld were born here. Sending them into the wild wouldn't be noble. It could be fatal. When they freed Keiko, the killer whale of movie fame, the effort was a failure and he perished.
As a retirement project, it was a 100% success. He lived in his natural habitat. He was born in Iceland. The health problems he suffered from all cleared up. He thrived for 5+ years. How is that a failure?
China's now in its heyday of setting up marine parks on every corner, practically.
I mean, double-digit increases in numbers of facilities from year to year. It's frightening how fast they're building these places.
The idea that you're taking naive trainers, so to speak, and dropping in freshly caught killer whales into parks in China is terrifying. I'm not sure we'll ever hear about it if something happens, but something will happen.
And we don't even have accounts of how many die in the tanks or in the transport, but they just keep coming.
There's no functional breeding program. They are getting all of their animals from the wild. Belugas, bottlenose dolphins, and now orcas. It's absolutely a disaster in the making.
It seemed to me that the Chimelong Park is being built and marketed to and for Chinese people. It's built for the middle class, for those 800 million who will be here. That's what they're serving up to them. We know they brought in 9 from Russia, 9 orcas, and the plan is to breed them.
In captivity, they will start breeding them, artificially or naturally, as soon as they're sexually mature. And the way I think of it is as it's children having children.
Building in a warehouse somewhere right now, but how many survived the capture and the transport, we don't know. We have the warehouse coordinates. We know exactly where it is. They have an army of security people there to keep people out. So they're on high alert. Went down the right road and were met by one security guard who turned us away. He was quite rude and angry because we're there. We found another way in. We talked to a construction worker who was very open and honest about it. He said, yeah, right over there, that's where the marine mammals are held. This is the right area. It could be that building right there. That's the GPS coordinates of the 9 orcas we're looking for, right there. We walked through the construction site, which looked like it's going to be a huge tank in the future. Made our way to the exact coordinates, and we knew we were in the right place because we kept finding evidence of marine mammal transport boxes, stretchers, frozen fish containers, buckets, and all the usual stuff. We just saw a truck going by. It's a refrigerated truck. One of the things you want to look for is refrigerated trucks carrying fish. It takes 1,000 pounds of fish every day to feed these 9 whales. That looks like a tank. Metal tank, right? As we got closer to the facility, I noticed a filtration system. Clearly a filtration system, so I knew we were very close, and over to the right were several walk-in freezers. This matches exactly the coordinates, the GPS coordinates. This is it. We're there. The orcas are here someplace. We were about to go inside and work our way into the building with a camera to photograph the orcas. And we were spotted by 2 Western trainers I saw there. Whipped out their cell phones, and now there are several trainers with cell phones. Well, they kept us for about an hour and a half, something like that, asking the same questions over and over again. We were very concerned about going to jail. Going to jail in China could be pretty ugly. The reason they didn't call the police is they would look incompetent because somehow we got through their security and got to the building. And they didn't want the authorities to reprimand them for it.
A lot of people ask me, how are we going to solve this problem with China? How are we going to convince so many people? But I think it might be a lot simpler than that, because we actually only have to convince one person. The one person who controls the whole of China, because he says what goes.
Animals used to perform in zoos. They ended that overnight because there was enough controversy about it and enough information coming from the West that the Chinese government said, okay, we're going to make that illegal, and it was illegal. And I think that, you know, there's the ivory trade, for example, a similar thing has happened. They go to these international treaty forums, they hear it, they know that they are looking regressive, and they don't like that. They want to lead.
The trick will be to get to that one man. And I'm not quite sure how we're going to do it, but China watches what we do. And they're not foolish people by any means. And if we show how wrong that is, then maybe they'll just do the right thing.
It's about those children who are sitting next to their parent who are endorsing this whole thing just by their presence. And those children will walk out of that stadium believing that's what dolphins are for. That's what orcas are for, to entertain us. That is dangerous to the young mind of the Chinese.
But we have to put our hope in children to stand up and say no, to children who will cheer for the animals in the wild and will demand of their parents, no matter where they live on the planet, that we treat these animals with understanding and care and keep them in the wild.
If I were able to speak Chinese or Russian and I was talking to a group of children who thought they might want to grow up and be a trainer, I would tell them everything that I know and everything that I learned about the realities and the suffering for the animals that they would be working with. And I would want them to think carefully about why they were doing that, right? I would want them to have an understanding that it's not in the best interest of the animals.
The only hope of winning this war is for the public to stop buying tickets.
Don't buy a ticket.
Don't buy a ticket at SeaWorld.
Don't buy a ticket.
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 Don't ever, ever buy a ticket.
Don't buy a ticket.